or the 115 page?
Mine, and then we'll just share it to 115.
Or you're sharing it live on 115?
Comrade Namkosi will share it live on 115.
Okay. Let me see if it's on yours. Yeah, meeting is now streaming live on Facebook, it says.
Oh yeah, I can see.
Perfect.
Okay, so Comrade Khalid, while we are waiting on our second speaker, we will for now just welcome you and thank you for accepting this invitation and being here. Initially, we were supposed to have an audience, or rather a panel of 3 people, but unfortunately one person had to to go away because they had a bereavement at home, and unfortunately they could not join us. We know it was a bit of a busy day. We saw you were part of the Youth Parliament, and then from there you also gave a talk on the Tripartite Alliance racism lecture as well. So thank you very much for putting time and being part of this discussion. So as you are aware, Comrade Khalid, we're speaking about racism, and we are ultimately trying to answer to see if can we get to a point in time whereby we have a colorblind generation, right? Comrade Naledi unfortunately can't join us at this present time, but she will be joining us later within the feed, and hopefully she'll join us while we're still fresh in discussion. So I just want us quickly to just establish common grounds on racism and define what racism is. Steve Biko, in his book or in his article in Black Souls in White Masks, he defined racism as discrimination by a group against another for the purpose of subjugation or maintaining subjugation. I'll just end there for now. Would you say you agree with this quote by Ubiko on what racism is? You will have to unmute yourself, Comrade Khalid. You are on mute.
Okay, Comrade Lukulu Manko, thank you so much. So the format, are we having is it going to be a dialogue now, or do you want me to make my input first? Or?
So for now, we'll just have a conversation, and then eventually we'll get to a part where you'll do your address, and then that's where Comrade Naledi will join in afterwards.
Okay. I hear you. Can I just get a sense of how long are we going to wait until Comrade? So we'll have the dialogue. I agree.
We'll continue in an absence for now.
Okay. So we'll have the dialogue, and then we'll see how long she's taking to come, and then
she is actually the very last speaker, so it's fine. We're still on the right track.
Okay, no, that's fine. So do you want me to give an input now, or just respond to your question?
So first respond to my question. How would you define racism?
Look, racism, I would define very much in line with the definition that you've just provided, Steve Biko's definition. And I think that particular definition is still very much alive and kicking in South Africa today, even if we look at the legacy of apartheid, the material legacy of apartheid. Racism as a form of discrimination, which is linked to power dynamics. It's inextricably linked to power.
Okay.
So subjugation, discrimination, but tied, I would say, to power dynamics,
So he goes on to further say that, in other words, one cannot be a racist unless there's the power to subjugate. What blacks are doing is merely to respond to a situation in which they find themselves the objects of white racism. So this would be basically speaking about what people call the reverse racism, which causes a lot of debate and controversy. If can a black person be labeled a racist? Do you think that a black person has the power to be a racist, or do you think that they can discriminate, perhaps maybe against a white person, but not necessarily being a racist?
You see, now, that is why I asked you the question about whether I'm going to do the input, because this is a matter that I address in
your address.
Yes. I do address this in my input.
Okay, I
So
think then if you're going to cover this and perhaps maybe other things, then I think
yes,
you can shoot straight to your address.
I think
And
it's
then
better that
when
I,
Comrade Naledi joins in, she will just also give her address and then we'll engage both on what
and
has
then
been
we
said,
can have
taking also into
a
consideration,
discussion.
yeah, what was said on Facebook as well.
Certainly,
Yeah,
certainly, because a lot of the questions you're asking speaks to the input that I have prepared, you know.
feel free,
So thank you. Can I go ahead?
dive in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Firstly, let me firstly thank the branch. My greetings to the leadership of the branch. Such initiatives by branches, which are the most basic living organs of the ANC and people's power, um, ought to be uh, ought to be celebrated. They ought to be commended. And from the onset, I would like to thank the leadership and membership of the ANC Ward 115 branch for coming forward and hosting us in this important online conversation. Um, as a branch covering areas in the constituency, that meaning the Cape Town Central and the Atlantic Seaboard, to which I am deployed as a member of the provincial legislature, I'm I'm really grateful, comrades, for the opportunity that you have given me to engage. Youth Month, and I thought let's set the context of the discussion, or let's set the basis of the discussion within the context of Youth Month. Um, Youth Month, comrades, every year allows the young people of the day to reflect on our historical mission. Now, it's important that we engage with the issue of race within the context of whom we are as a generation. The question we therefore uh, ask ourselves again today is, as we do every June, is what is our historical mission as young people today? Are we on track as the young people who believe in the ideals and vision of a non-racial South Africa in pursuing that South Africa? This year, comrades, we reflect on this task within the context of COVID-19, when the world is grappling with this pandemic. Yet we know, as we have reflected in the last few weeks, that the pandemic has once again highlighted our challenges, highlighted our weaknesses as a society, and showed us even more why we must bring about the national democratic society, which is non-racial in its character, that we believe in. COVID-19 has actually shown us that unemployment amongst young people, especially that the unemployment amongst young people, especially which remains, that there's unemployment amongst young people and that it remains racially characterized. COVID-19 has displayed the sharp racially characterized inequality that exists within our society, especially when it comes to healthcare, education, both basic and tertiary education, as well as services such as policing, transport, and other governmental services. COVID-19 has once again shown how poverty continues to keep our Black communities trapped, especially when this poverty is generational. Often we find that when a young man or woman is not working, then his or her father or mother also didn't work in our Black communities. But COVID-19 has also starkly shown our weakness as a society as far as gender-based violence is concerned. In the last few days, the Western Cape has not been spared in the slaughtering of our sisters and their children at the hands of cowardly partners. All these point to something that is truly toxic within our post-racial, or our, let me rather say, our post-apartheid society, which is still very much racially stratified. And it is young people who are the victims and young people who are the perpetrators. But it is also mainly young people who can tackle these issues. Hence, it's important that young people understand race, understand and whether a colorless or color-blind generation is possible. Yet at the same time, we cannot also ignore what is happening across the globe in the exposure of a virus that has been with us for a long time, the illness of racism. As we salute and stand in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters, especially in the United States and the UK, we must once again highlight where there is classism and capitalism, there will be exploitation and racism. Capitalism can never survive without exploitation, and it is the breeding ground for racism. For too long, the American and British societies have ignored the role that slavery, the slavery of black people, may I add, played in the building of those two empires in particular. The US and the UK, like apartheid South Africa, was built on the backs of black people through the exploitation of black people. Georgetown University professor in history, um, uh, 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 Professor Marsha uh, Professor Marsha Chatelain says, she writes, and I open quote, "What is happening to America isn't simply about racism, because racism needs other counterparts in order to grow and feed itself. This is also a referendum on capitalism. It is about the economic inequality and the fact that we have allowed a certain segment of the population to brutalize others without accountability." Close quote. Yet the story, comrades, of racism and exploitation in America and Britain is the story of exploitation and racism here in South Africa. We, 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 we experience poverty, unemployment, inequality, gender-based violence, all based on race in South Africa. While, yes, indeed, there are white people who are poor in our country, white people who are unemployed, and white women who suffer at the hands of their partners, the overwhelming and structural violence, the emphasis on structural, is against black people in our country. The vast majority of black people remain poor. The vast majority of those who are unemployed and unskilled remain black. The vast majority of those who suffer of gender-based violence are black women. This is the reality of the challenge of our Youth Month in 2020 when this discussion takes place. The challenge we therefore face today as young people in South Africa are very different to the kind of challenges that the class of 76 faced now 44 years ago, even though they were taking on racism. In 76, quality education was an issue. And yes, even today, access to quality education remains a challenge. However, we have also made great strides in the last 26 years in ensuring that more black people have graduated with university degrees in the last 26 years than in the entire history of our country before 1994. The class of 76 fought for mother tongue education, and we must continue to pursue the goal of mother tongue education, especially at the primary school level. But the uprising of 76 remained one of the most pivotal moments of our country's history and of black history on the continent. It set off a series of events that would put South Africa onto a path of no return. But the uprising also, having founded itself in the, and this takes us to the questions that you pose as we start the discussion, Comrade Chair of the session, having founded itself in the thinking of black consciousness and led by, among others, Steve Biko, 1976 ensured that black young people, and when we say black, colored, Indian, and African in the South African context, were united in the quest for a better life and a better education. So strong and determined were young people in creating black unity that it put apartheid on notice. And so that by the start of the 1980s, the apartheid project was in serious trouble, forcing P.W. Botha to reform it through the tricameral system. These events of 1976 laid the foundation for the UDF to be formed as an antithesis to the tricameral system and eventually led to the Botha regime being weakened into declaring a state of emergency. Subsequently, sanctions were imposed, the workers' movement COSATU was launched, and our leaders were eventually freed. All this because young people understood their mission, but also understood the importance of black unity. The question is, are we using our power today? What are we doing with our power today? What kind of discussions are we having? Are we prepared to be victims or makers of history? As we see across the world, young people can also be victims of racism and capitalism. Young people can also be the most fervent advocates of the right wing and racism. We see in countries such as the US, such as the UK, such as Brazil, such as India, that it is young people who are putting people like Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro, Modi into power. It is young Indians who actually go into the streets and volunteer and ensure that Modi gets elected and rile up the racial tensions, the Hindu-Muslim tensions in India. Young people are driving that right-wing change. So it is therefore incumbent on us as young people who claim to espouse principles of anti-racism to also take our rightful place. That is why conversations such as these are important. We must ensure that we too start to influence our own political formations, our own organizations, our own movements. Young people must take up the leadership in society, like Alexandria Cortez and Ilhan Omar are doing in the Democratic Party in the US. We have seen generational mix in other countries. In the history of the ANC, this generational mix was also most personified in the ANC's National Conference of 1949. The National Party had been elected into office the year before and was starting to implement apartheid. Writing at the time of the need to change the tactics of the ANC, Professor Z.K. Matthews wrote, and I open quote, he said, gradually the idea emerged that the time had come for a more militant policy. For years, African organizations had pinned their faith on moderation, on petitions, deputations, on mild requests for this or for that concession, on what they called constitutional methods of struggle. They had met every deprivation of their rights with the hope that it was only temporary and that they would eventually earn rights of citizenship by their loyalty and the recognition of their contribution to the country. Surely reasons would prevail over unreason. Now they began to realize that the country was being set on a different course, which meant permanent denial of any stake in the country for them, close quote. In other words, now you may ask, why am I veering onto issues of youth focus? No. In order for us to actually understand our mission, in order for us to actually take on the racism and tackle racism that we are trying to define and understand, we need to understand our generational mission. We need to, as young people, come to the fore. We cannot be theorizing and having the discussions if we are not organized and found in positions of influence. Like here is a clear example. This branch 115 is led by young people. We have Comrade Lukulu Manko, who's a branch secretary, emerged organically. Comrade Nobukosi is a young person serving in the regional structure of the ANC. So in other words, the generation of 1949 knew that in order to meet the historical duty of their generation, a new tactics were needed in order to pursue the struggle. Eventually, Comrade Walter Sisulu was elected as the SG of the ANC, and younger ones such as Mandela and Tambo represented the Youth League in the NEC of the ANC. That generation initiated the M Plan, the Defiance Campaign, mobilized on the grounds of civil disobedience, and would eventually lead the ANC to establishing the armed wing Umkhonto weSizwe. Yet crucially, they had the support of the people, communities, and were in touch with sentiments on the ground. So even these discussions, it's important to be theoretically clear. It's important for us to emerge organizationally in order to drive change and fight racism. But in all of this, we need to have organic activism. We need to be grounded amongst our people. That's most important. The generation of 76 then took up the baton from the youth of 49, a milestone generation after nearly 30 years, nearly 40 years on from 76. Where is our milestone generation, I may ask? From this generation of 76 came many heroes and heroines from across the Western Cape. But again, they were in touch with the communities from which they came. When you're in touch with communities and understand community struggles, you will then understand issues of race. We'll then understand whether a colorless or colorblind generation is possible. We will be able to defeat challenges of race-based inequalities in our country, just as young people defeated apartheid, but we must unite. We must ensure that we are with our young people, engaging them at all times, serving them and allowing them to determine their own future. Comrades, it is appropriate that this particular discussion takes place in Youth Month, because we must not forget that the origins of June 16, 1976, as I stated earlier, lie very much with the Black consciousness movement. Many misunderstandings around Black consciousness persist. Non-racialism, as espoused by the Freedom Charter and the Congress movement, was not opposed to the embrace of BC. There's this notion that the embrace of Black consciousness actually runs counter to the non-racialism in the Freedom Charter. That's why many of our comrades, you will find, were leaders of organizations such as the South African Student Organization, or SASO, like Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, for example. Tokyo Sexwale was also coming from the Black consciousness background. Many, they were a variety. Comrade Walter Sisulu could later say, an open quote, he says, "We in the ANC did not regard the emergence of the Black consciousness movement as hostile. We regarded it as part and parcel of the struggle, and we welcomed it as a progressive idea." So what we have emerging in June 1976 is not just a rejection of Afrikaans as a medium of learning. And it is important to note the difference. It was not a rejection of the language of Afrikaans per se, but rather a rejection of Afrikaans as a medium of learning, but a manifestation or a climax of Black consciousness amongst the young people at the time. And so what you have is not a colorblind generation, but rather a generation that reaffirms their dignity as Black people, African, colored, and Indian. That we can proudly articulate that, yes, we are proud to be Black, despite what apartheid says about us. We as Black people will be united in the fight against this injustice, close quote. Later, we will see the re-emergence of the Black consciousness during the Fees Must Fall episode, for example, recognition of the right of the Black child to access quality higher education. We see semblance of Black consciousness now also in the United States and across the world with the Black Lives Matter campaign. This is not a campaign that is foreign to South Africa. We have had it since the 1970s, and particularly under the tutelage of Steve Biko and Onkgopotse Tiro. In other words, again, it is not a call to be colorblind, comrades. Now, many, especially in the Congress movement, would say, but we are fighting for non-racialism. And so it is important that in this phase of struggle, as we pursue the National Democratic Revolution, to remember again that we must recognize race as a factor of injustice, and that if we want to address injustice, we need to recognize race. Again, Comrade Walter Sisulu, when reflecting on Black consciousness, said, open quote, "Racism and the maintenance of the privilege the whites enjoy," and I think Comrade Lukulumanko, this speaks to the question that you pose in intro, where Comrade Walter says, "Racism and the maintenance of the privileges the whites enjoy have become so hopelessly intermeshed in the life and thoughts of the whites that a reactive anti-whiteism as a phase in the development of the political consciousness of the individual Blacks is almost unavoidable. The fact that non-racialism is a leitmotif in the programs of almost all the forces of the struggle becomes an outstanding testimony of the maturity of the political and philosophical outlook, and also points to the deeper economic factors that are at play and which rise above and beyond the constraints of racism. Put differently, as the writer Angela Davis says, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So given the challenges we face in the world and in South Africa, which are fundamentally based on race, we cannot afford, I would say, to be a colorblind generation. To call for a colorblind society is one thing, and indeed, that is what we are striving for in the end. But it is the non-racist society that the National Democratic Revolution is fighting for. But to be a colorblind generation is to suggest that we must forget the past, as some, especially the liberals, are so quick to do. If we call for a colorblind generation, comrades, we then will have to drop mechanisms such as triple BEE and employment equity. And hence we see organizations such as the Democratic Alliance fighting for the scrapping of triple BEE. If we call for a colorblind generation, we'll have to ignore the fact that the majority of women and children suffering at the hands of their partners in this country are Black. If we call for a colorblind generation, we'll have to ignore that the majority of people who suffer from inequality, from poverty and unemployment are Black, especially young Black people. So in order to pursue the National Democratic Revolution, and particularly to achieve the National Democratic Society, we have to ensure that race is used to address past injustices, and that does not make one racist. Today, the majority of Black people are without land. We ask why. This is not an accident of history. It was deliberate that on the 20th of June 1913, the so-called native was declared a pariah in his or her own land, as Comrade Saul Plaatje wrote. White people were never slaves in the history of humanity. Only Africans, Asians, and those indigenous peoples from Latin America were slaves, and Persians as well, at a particular stage in history. Slavery was based on race. We don't want to use race. We as Black people were not the ones who made race a factor in the manner in which we analyze things. White people did that and still benefit from that. And so now we have to correct those injustices. But it would help if white people recognize their privilege and help defeat racism. It is not reverse racism either. There is no such thing as reverse racism, because inherent in racism is the question of power. And white people, because of white privilege, which continues to persist, exercise and enjoy power among the races. That is the bottom line. And that, I think, answers the question that was posed at the beginning. So I look forward to the rest of the interactive discussions that are to follow, comrades. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Khalid. I think I agree with you on everything basically you've said, because you've touched base on quite a number of things. You've touched base on the Native Land Act, on one race basically being the human race. You've also spoken about, the doors of education being open to all. But as you know, today we are celebrating the 65th anniversary of the Freedom Charter, which we call the guiding document, for democracy in South Africa. Would you say that the Freedom Charter deals sufficiently with the issue of race and racism? Would you say that there are any clauses within the Freedom Charter that it fails to deal or address racism optimally?
Comrade, look, I think we need to read the Freedom Charter within the context within which it was written.
Yeah.
The Freedom Charter was crafted in 1955. 1955, it was crafted within a context wherein which there wasn't this heightened sense of Black consciousness, and even a heightened sense of the deprivation at an ideological level of the Black majority. So it was written within that context. So I won't say that it fails. I will say it was, for the context within which it was written, for the context in which the Freedom Charter was drafted, given what was happening in South Africa at the time, and given the kind of stage that the Congress movement was in at the time, I think it at least provided a basis for a much more deeper conversation. So I don't think it's insufficient necessarily. I think the Freedom Charter needs to be read within the context of later discussions, in the context of the actual activism that was inspired by the Freedom Charter, but also within the context of the strategy and tactics document that was drafted in Tanzania, Morogoro, in 1969. That for me becomes crucial. So the Freedom Charter lays a theoretical basis for what we then find with the Morogoro Conference and the 1969 Strategy and Tactics of the African National Congress.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you touch base on the Morogoro Conference, because it's something I planned to highlight earlier on, with the adoption of it, because it was shortly after the Freedom Charter, where they were also taking into cognizance of the fact that in as much as, your so-called Black people are the most oppressed, but your colored people, your Indian people also remain, oppressed, and they should be brought into the table. So I think my second last question would be, a couple of days back, Helen Zille had posted had argued on Twitter that we now have more racist laws compared to the apartheid era. Of course, then you had the Native Land Act you'd highlighted. We had, acts that prohibited mixed marriages, mixed political parties, etc. What would be your thoughts on that? Perhaps maybe the racist laws she was speaking about would be your Triple BEE Act, your Unfair Discrimination Act, your Employment Equity Act. What would be your thoughts on that specific matter of Helen?
Let me be frank, comrades. I personally had a lot of respect for Helen over the years, and to much of the critique of fellow comrades. I often had a great sense of admiration, despite my disagreement with her politics, a more liberal posture. I often had great admiration for the role that she played, even as a journalist, for hosting some of the likes of Comrades Tony Ngeni and Larumo Kalako and others when they were on the run. And some of when she started off in the leadership of the Democratic Alliance, yes, I was critical because there was this liberal paternalism, but what we've seen now, I mean, I've lost complete respect for the woman. She's an absolute racist. And that's clear. She's an absolute racist. She's not even a liberal any longer, if we look at it. Because it's not even how the liberal are, because the liberal will say, no, apartheid laws were wrong, they were racist. These laws are not racist, but they're discriminatory also. We're all under the same conditions, we are the same. But here to actually say that apartheid laws were less racist than now, and that that's right wing. It's a right wing approach. So what it does is what Zille is doing there. Firstly, the definition of racism is completely out of sync. It's a definition of racism coming from the vantage point of privilege. So that's the major problem with what she has been tweeting. And I think actually what's coming out now more and more is that underlying, because now I think, yes, you admired some of these white liberals, but now when you read the likes of Biko now, Biko starts to make more sense, because Biko warned about them. Even those who were involved in the Black Sash, who were involved in the student movement, in the anti-apartheid movement, he warned about the way in which they will try to direct the Black struggle, because they've not opposed white privilege. So they will be paternalistic, they will want to define your struggle, and have such superficial readings. And this is even in line, even if you look, that is why her mentor, the late Helen Suzman, if I look back now, Helen Suzman could say, no, we only have a problem with the way in which the regime treats Mandela in prison, but not with the fact that he's in prison. because he's in prison because he undertook some terrorist activities, because they didn't fundamentally disagree with the system. They didn't, liberals, even during apartheid. So even if we say Zille is not right-wing, but she's still within a liberal tradition with what she's saying, even liberals didn't have a problem with the fact that black people were not allowed to vote. They had no problem with that. Yes, some of them said, no, okay, only those who own land. The more progressive liberals said, no, those blacks who own land can vote. But how do black people own land? So, I mean, but yes, no, so definitely what this reflects is an absolute, it's a very disingenuous and dishonest analysis of racism. And it also fails to honestly capture what apartheid meant as a system, let alone a set of laws. It also fails to understand white privilege, because let me also add, even with triple BEE, even with positive discrimination, as we call it, still the level, the playing field is not even level as yet. Still you will have, even in those companies that are BEE, triple BEE compliant, you will find most of the big companies, even those that are getting work from the DA-led provincial government, they will all, in terms of the tick box, they will all be triple BE, but you will find who are the real bosses. It's white monopoly capital.
True, true. Comrade Khalid, there's a question here which is saying, how can we as South Africans overcome the divisions that exist among us in the form of tribalism and discrimination between colored, Indian, and Black communities to unite and confront the monster of racism? Now, I'm guessing this question is coming from the white privilege to Black people, as you had defined earlier on.
Yes, no, I do. And that's a good question. You see, what apartheid had done, particularly in the period before 1976, but even post, I think people understood it better then, was that it sought to divide Black people and build superiority complexes amongst Black people. And they did it even through the kind of laws. For example, if you look at the Western Cape, African people were the most discriminated against. There was a Color Bar Act where colored people were given a few more opportunities. You had these things. So the divide and rule strategy was working, even if you were given a slight advantage, you were still disadvantaged in the bigger scheme of things. It was peanuts that you were getting. So for me, the best way is actually first to understand, have engagements such as these, to firstly understand what is race and what is racism, to understand what is white privilege, and to understand that all of us together, as Indians, as Africans, as colored people, as we are all actually victims of the same. And here in the Western Cape, it actually becomes easier, because in the Western Cape, you have a situation where white monopoly doesn't discriminate between African, Indian, and colored. It's brutal equally against it. It's just that sometimes maybe the Indian person will see themselves as more white, or the colored will see himself as, you will have these kind of things. But in reality, at the material level, the treatment is the same. So I think we need to firstly engage in dialogue such as this to understand what is white privilege, to understand how we are affected by it. But also, I think at the very practical level, I think practical activist solidarity needs to actively take place beyond the color line. We need to understand that class, our issue of we need to understand that it is the class oppression that actually unites us. We need to understand that we need to actively make moves. For example, when there's a struggle in Khayelitsha for housing, activists who are taking up the issues in Mitchell's Plain need to be encouraged to go into Khayelitsha and stand together with it. Activists in Guguletu must be able to stand together with activists in Manenberg fighting gangsterism, for example. We must be able to identify common grounds with our struggles, and actually, and also, I think we need to take a much more firmer and harsher stance, even at a very informal social level, when it comes to prejudice amongst each other. I won't say racism, but let me say prejudice amongst each other. When there are comments, even in jest, when there are generalizations that are made between African, Black, and colored people, we need to make sure that we dispel them immediately. We must actually declare war on those things in our circles because we need to unite. So I think it's possible, but we need to be very, very practical when doing so. And we also, again, it takes me to this thing of our generation. That's why the unity of our generation as young people becomes paramount.
Would you then say that the continued use of, you know, your different terms like Black, colored, Indian, do you think that terminology in a post-apartheid country has also contributed to the huge discrimination within the groups? Perhaps maybe if we had opted to have one term, like maybe Black, like it highlighted on, which was the same definition the Black consciousness movement used towards the non-whites, which is to group everything that was classified as non-whites. Would you say perhaps maybe if we'd done away with those titles of you colored, you Indian, you Black, you African, and so on, and we just adopted one term, do you think perhaps maybe that would have, you know, brought about change?
I think so. Maybe at the time, and again, here again, I speak about the importance of time and space because you see, at the time when we had those terminologies, we were still, in a sense, grappling with, again, we were still, in a sense, also in the Morogoro phase where we were saying that the liberation, we need to liberate Africans in particular and Blacks in general. So we were still in that, and I still think very much so. Africans are still the most discriminated against in South Africa. Maybe in the Western Cape context where you've got a colored majority and there's more in common. So I think to a great extent, I do agree with you. We needed to build a greater sense of Black unity and Black consciousness and not have these particular terms. But maybe at the time, our leadership was still grappling as to how do we deal with this issue practically. So there needed to be, but I think now, particularly our generation, while we must not be colorblind, I think that our generation needs to move, at least within the Black context, to move towards an eradication of terms such as African, colored, and Indian, because you will find even at the class level, people may have been able to progress. You will find that many a times, or in the majority of cases, there's more similarity between the material conditions of an African child and a colored child, for example, and even an Indian child in a poor community, you know.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Comrade Khalid, I think this is our last question for the night. It's a question, it's asking, what is the significance of land redistribution in dealing with racism?
Very important, because my input alluded to the role that land dispossession played in terms of heightening or the racial divide, but in terms of also heightening white privilege and heightening Black deprivation. So clearly, you see, because once we return the land to its rightful owners, we return a sense of dignity to people. Dignity is returned. There's greater economic opportunity. And as we resolve those issues in our society, as people's dignity is restored, as people's economic opportunity is increased, an economic opportunity that has been taken away because of racism, that has been taken away on the basis of race, we can then start actually easing even the racial tensions and sense of resentment that is building up amongst many young black people towards the white population. So I think the issue of land reform, and I think really my call to white South Africans is, and I really want to appeal to the hearts and minds of white South Africans, particularly young white South Africans. When we talk about expropriation of land without compensation, we are not saying that we are going to be coming to your house and kick you off and take your land that you have there. No, we are speaking about taking that which rightfully belongs to our people through a legal process, land which is also not being utilized. There's a whole there's a mechanism, and also Black people for so many years in this country have been patient, have been forgiving, have been doing things in a non-racial manner in majority. All we are saying here is that this is an opportunity for us to actually properly heal in a sustainable manner as a nation. And South Africa shouldn't be special. In many other countries where this type of dispossession has happened, we have found redress. So I think if white South Africans want to be fully part and parcel of the non-racial project and nation building, it's not just about putting on a Springbok jersey or celebrating 67 minutes of Nelson Mandela. That era is over now. That is a lip service. Yes, celebrate Madiba, wear the Springbok jersey, but do it within the context of wanting to fully embrace healing and redress in our country, because it is only through redress that we are going to properly heal as a nation. And the dispossession of land is the original sin against Black people in South Africa in 1913.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, and I love the way you put it, because it's been made a very thorny issue by the media, and that is why you have countries such as Australia and New Zealand saying that they will open up their borders to our white farmers, because the narrative which has been put out there is that we are out to drive white people away from South Africa, which is false, because we have already seen certain parts in South Africa where there has been land redistribution without any bloodshed, peacefully done so. It's a very important thing that you're talking about. And I think when the media reflects on this, they need to be quite truthful in it, in how they also report about it, to avoid unnecessary unrest in the country where the minority feels that they're now being oppressed by the majority. But Comrade Khalid, I think we will end it there, because I don't think we have any further questions. I see 2 comments quickly here. Colored people were struggling at the time. Okay, no, I think it's actually it's a comment. I'll just quickly read it out. It is from Willard Ibrahim. He's saying colored people, just struggling to open his comment now. He's saying colored people were struggling more at the time to identify themselves as people, and such great deviations existed within the colored community, whereas Black Africans and Indians were very firmly established in their identity as people. I think this perhaps maybe speaks to the identity we're speaking about at the time, and the terms used to call each certain group with an identity.
Yes.
But Comrade Khalid, I want to thank you so much for your time. I don't think Comrade Naledi will be joining us, also looking at the time. It's been 1 hour, 7 minutes.
I don't think so. I think we're already
I think she's still experiencing
1 hour
problems
and
wherever
12
she is.
minutes over that, but it's fine. I think we've had a good conversation. And I want to also thank people who have posed questions on the Facebook page and for the interactive discussion. And I want to also thank the branch. I think particularly not only as the Youth League chair, but as the member of provincial legislature for the Cape Town Central and Atlantic Seaboard constituency. I want to say that this is a great initiative, and I think more branches in our sub-region should be having these particular programs, because it also provides an opportunity for us to actually build. This is how we build real organization. Not only through filling in forms and running around and recruiting, that's important, but through providing politics, through engaging, through the battle of ideas. And I want to say that this forum also feel free to use this forum as a space where, as the public rep, I can also account to the constituency as well. So this is really going to be something that I think the rest of the constituency is going to learn from, comrades.
Well, thank you so much, Comrade Khalid. I think we will end it there for the night. Thank you so much for your time. We
Thank
know
you
it's
so
been a
much,
hectic
comrades.
day on your side. It's been
No.
meeting after meeting after meeting we've seen. But thank you so much
And I
for
think
honoring
we've
our
been together
invitation.
in most of these. I saw you were in the youth parliament as well.
On the day. Well, thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Comrade Khalid. Have a lovely evening.
You have a lovely evening, Comrade Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
likewise.
Thanks.
Sure.
Bye-bye. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.